If you want to answer this, you have to go back and look at the choices that were made right after the last huge financial crisis.
To really get how we got to where we are today, we have to rewind the clock to 2008. The entire global financial system was, and I mean this literally, on the brink of a total meltdown. And the Federal Reserve decided it had to do something.
The housing market had just collapsed, and that sent these massive shockwaves through the whole banking system. Panic was everywhere. Credit markets completely froze up. The entire economy was just staring into the abyss. The system needed a savior, and it needed one fast.
So the Fed steps in with this incredibly radical plan. First, they slash interest rates down to basically zero. Then they unleash this powerful, kind of mysterious new tool called quantitative easing, or QE for short. The whole goal was to pump a ton of cash into the banks to get them to start lending again, and it was sold to all of us as a temporary emergency fix. So what did all this actually do? We gotta pop the hood and look at the mechanics of this brand new money machine.
First up, let's talk about QE, quantitative easing. Now, it's not like they're just printing stacks of cash and handing it out. Think of it more like this. The Fed creates new digital money out of thin air and uses it to buy things like government bonds from the big banks. So the banks get a flood of new cash and the Fed gets the bonds. The result, the money supply available to Wall Street just explodes.
And working right alongside QE was something called ZIRP, the zero interest rate policy. By keeping its main interest rate near zero, the Fed made it unbelievably cheap for banks, hedge funds, and giant corporations to borrow money. The hope, the theory, was that this would kickstart a huge wave of productive investment all across America.
Now this slide, this is where you can see the sheer scale of what happened. That temporary fix from 2008, well, it never really went away. The Fed's balance sheet, which is just a fancy term for all the stuff it bought, it just ballooned from less than $1 trillion to over $8 trillion. Easy money wasn't an emergency measure anymore, it was the new normal. But here's the trillion-dollar question. Where did all that money actually go? That it didn't really fund a bunch of new factories or help out small businesses. No, instead, this ocean of cheap debt flooded right into the financial markets, fueling a wild, decade-long party for Wall Street and encouraging all sorts of high-risk speculation.
So let's get into the consequences, because this policy, which was supposed to save the economy for everyone, it ended up creating this starkly divided reality with some very, very clear winners and some very clear losers. And what's fascinating is that inside the Fed's own powerful committee, this wasn't a unanimous decision. Thomas Hoenig, who was the president of the Kansas City Fed, he became the lone voice of dissent. Over and over again, he voted no, warning that this whole experiment was a dangerous path that would warp the economy and create huge risks down the line. And this slide, it just lays out the book's core argument perfectly. Easy money essentially created two separate economies. If you owned assets, stocks, real estate, it was a golden age. You could borrow for next to nothing, buy more assets, and just watch your wealth skyrocket. But if you were a saver or just earning a wage, it was a totally different story. Your savings account earned nothing, while the cost of everything, especially a place to live, just went through the roof. For regular folks, the fallout was direct and frankly painful. You had retirees watching their nest eggs get eaten alive by inflation because their savings were earning 0.1%. At the same time, massive private equity firms were using that same cheap Fed-fueled debt to buy up thousands of single-family homes, turning them into rentals and pricing ordinary families right out of the market. So all of this created a deep, deep dependency. The financial markets basically got addicted to the constant flow of easy money. And this created a really fragile system that the book argues is caught in this dangerous feedback loop, a doom loop. Then, in September of 2019, a crisis hit. But not in the stock market where everyone could see it. It happened in a place called the repo market. The best way to think about it is like the secret, vital plumbing of Wall Street. It's the overnight lending market that banks absolutely depend on to function. And for a few terrifying days, it just froze solid. And this is where the scale becomes truly mind-bending. To get the plumbing working again, the Fed had to inject a staggering $4.5 trillion. This wasn't a bailout for Main Street. This was a quiet, massive rescue for a financial system that had become dangerously hooked on the very easy money the Fed had been supplying. And that brings us to what Leonard calls the doom loop. It works like this. The market takes huge risks, knowing that if things go really wrong, the Fed will always step in and bail them out. That safety net encourages them to take even bigger risks next time, which creates the conditions for an even bigger crisis, which then requires an even larger bailout. You see the cycle?
So where does that leave us? Well, in a really precarious spot. After more than a decade of rock-bottom interest rates and pumping trillions into the system, the Fed's traditional toolkit is looking pretty empty. If another big crisis hits, the old solutions, they just might not work anymore.
Ultimately, the book doesn't give us any easy answers. Instead, it leaves us staring at this one deeply unsettling question. After we've fundamentally re-engineered our entire economy with a policy that was only meant for a short-term emergency, what happens next?